Good evening. As the room was filling and we were sitting here chatting, my colleague Keisha Ellis said to me, "I'll let you guys go first and I can just agree with everything you said." Now I find myself in the position to go last, having to, I guess, agree with everything that was said before me. But I would like to propose that perhaps we've been asking the wrong questions of Burma Road all along. So I'm going to look at these economic realities that were mentioned in the last presentation of 1942 that caused Bahamian workers to protest. I'm also going to look at some of the economic realities in the present day Bahamas based on various documents compiled over the past 5 or so years. So that data might then allow us to rethink the place that Burma Road holds or should hold in our national narrative. The prevailing theme in the narrative has been to interpret Burma Road as the first manifestation of political consciousness amongst the Bahamian masses that then directly and argued inevitably led to practically causing the formation of the Progressive Liberal Party 11 years later, majority rule 25 years later, and independence 31 years later. On the other hand, a competing, perhaps marginalized interpretation sees the events of May and June 1942 as a labor unrest caused by dire economic stress, which was, and I quote, later mythicized and used as a heroic movement by the blacks when a political movement had finally started, end quote. Even proponents of the former interpretation, though, admit that, whether first spark or not, quote, time and the remarkable foresight, courage and initiative of a few dedicated members of that majority were all that were required to crystallize this awareness into a mighty political force. Hence the political movement that then came about being seen as a vanguard of this mass protest of disgruntled workers. Furthermore, these words that I just quoted were by Doris Johnson. They stem from a time when she herself still stood to gain political capital from the mythification of Burma Road. On the other hand, another contemporary, H.M. Taylor, well past his political prime now, was much more cautious about ascribing too much importance to Burma Road, merely saying, and I quote again, "The bread and butter questions caused the riot. There was very little public opinion on matters of national importance among the masses before the rise of the PLP in 1953, end quote. So now let's look at the bread and butter that H.M. Taylor mentioned. In 1936, the minimum wage for unskilled labor was set at 4 shillings a day, or 20 shillings, that is £1 a week. In 1938, the year before the outbreak of World War II, the cost of living in New Providence was estimated to be 19 shillings a week. Minimum wage then would have just about paid the bills. However, with the war came heightened inflation caused by a variety of factors, such as the militarization of the industry, as well as the loss of existing and reallocation of remaining shipping capacities. By 1942, that is now the year after the United States also got drawn into the war, the cost of living is estimated to have increased by upward of 50% compared to the 1938 figures. Now, what we've seen before is really a sample price list of certain goods, but it's not really representative of a person's weekly needs. And it compared 1938 to 1942, showing that these prices have increased on average by 96.6%. So, either way, it is clear that by 1942, minimum wage was no longer a living wage. Minimum wage was indeed a starving wage. When the so-called project, a combined effort by the American and metropolitan British governments, locally handled by the colonial Bahamian government, was announced, it was hoped that Bahamian workers, perhaps as many as a couple of thousand, would be given an opportunity to earn American wages. Instead, the Bahamian government negotiated that they be paid at the local minimum wage rate. Ostensibly, this was done to protect Bahamian employers from having to compete with the project. As a result, Bahamian workers on the project were paid 4 shillings a day instead of what they had hoped for in the vicinity of 15 to, in fact, 20 shillings a day. That would have been the American wage for similar work. The role of the white American employees of the Pleasantville Corporation is not entirely clear in this. They are mostly described as foremen, thus by definition not doing the exact same work, or at least not playing the exact same role or bearing the exact same responsibility as the Bahamian workers employed. They were housed at the British Colonial Hotel, so there really can't have been more than a couple of hundred of them. And various contemporary commentators, as well as present-day authors, have reported very different rates of pay for these Americans, with 8 shillings being the lowest estimate I could find, or 40 shillings being the highest estimate I could find. So between 2 times and 10 times as much as the Bahamian workers. Being housed in a hotel, they also didn't have to worry about rent. However, what is also important to note, and this is the emphasis of the importance of bread and butter, is that after the riots, workers settled for a 25% increase from 4 to 5 shillings plus a free lunch on the site. So they were now being paid 5 shillings a day, which is still significantly less than A, their American counterparts, and B, significantly less than the cost of living required to survive in New Providence in 1942. I can only assume that this would have made the free lunch the most important meal of the day. Regardless of whether this was the alleged watershed moment in Bahamian racial and political consciousness or merely a spontaneous poverty riot, its results fell short of rectifying both the immediate problem as well as underlying causes. The Russell Commission, which has been mentioned before, for instance, recognized the systemic social injustice which characterizes the Bahamas and recommended, amongst other things, the adjustment of regressive import duties and the consideration of a more progressive income tax. That was in 1942. Fast forward to the present, regardless of whether Burma Road was a watershed moment in Bahamian racial and political consciousness or merely a spontaneous poverty riot later mythicized and exploited for political ends, the systemic social injustices remain. We have yet to discuss a progressive tax reform, and the only adjustment to the regressive import duties made paved the way for a new and uber-regressive value-added tax regime. You've all heard of that, I guess. A couple of months ago, at the funeral of a Bahamian lady who had placed great hopes in the political reforms of the 1960s and 70s, the eulogy concluded with the following words. She never understood why we replaced one set of self-serving tyrants with another set of the same. Now allow me to demonstrate how this plays out today in terms of wages compared to cost of living. 1942, minimum wage was then the equivalent, I'm now going to translate this into dollars, $4.04 a week, with the cost of living being upwards of $6 a week. Currently, minimum wage stands at $150 a week. 8% of Bahamian households, more than half of them consisting of 2 or more persons, have to survive on less than $5,000 a year. And as the household incomes increase, so does the household size. So the number of people having to live on minimum wage in this country is enormous. The 2013 Household Expenditure Survey conducted by the Bahamas Department of Statistics with the support of the Inter-American Development Bank suggests that 12.5% of Bahamian residents live below the poverty line. That poverty line is defined as $11.64 a day, out of which apparently $3.82 are earmarked for a, I quote, balanced low-cost diet of 2,400 calories a day. Now I don't know about you, but I cannot see a balanced diet at $3.82 a day. Call me strange. So All of that cut short, never trust any statistics that you haven't manipulated yourself. But I'm not sure how these IDB figures can stand in today's Bahamas with today's prices, suggesting that the household expenditure survey approach they took is flawed, for it fails to take into account charity received and charity received in the widest possible sense. In 1946, the Reverend H.H. Brown, during a widely noted sermon, expressed concern that the government had failed to learn the lesson of the riot, and further warned the powers that be that Burma Road would seem pale and insignificant in comparison with its successor. H.H. Brown's words. I posit that if we continue to look at Burma Road as merely the beginning, whether mythical or real, of a development that was in any way completed or finished in 1967 or 1973, we have still not learned the lesson. As a nation, we like to pride ourselves with having the third highest GDP per capita of any independent nation in the Western Hemisphere, but we fail to acknowledge that GDP per capita does not feed the nation if this goes hand in hand with the second highest income inequality of the Western Hemisphere. Perhaps Burma Road will then indeed seem pale and insignificant in comparison with its successor. Thank you very much.